couldn't afford a lawyer. My father's voice carried across the courtroom loud enough for everyone to hear. A few people sitting behind him chuckled under their breath. I kept walking. The heels of my navy dress shoes clicked softly against the old tile floor inside the Norfolk County Probate Court. I held a worn leather folder tightly against my chest and took my seat alone at the defense table. Dad leaned back in his chair wearing the same smug expression I'd seen my whole life whenever he thought he had the upper hand. My mother crossed her arms beside him and smiled thinly. "This'll be quick," she whispered. I don't think she meant for me to hear it, but I did. Their attorney, a heavyset man named Richard Bellamy, adjusted his expensive tie and glanced at me with open pity, or maybe contempt. Hard to tell sometimes. Judge Harold Bennett entered the courtroom a moment later and everyone rose. I stood straight automatically. 20 years in the Navy trains certain habits into your bones. The judge sat down, adjusted his glasses, and began reviewing the probate file involving my grandmother Linda Carter's estate. Outside the tall courthouse windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. The whole room smelled faintly like old paper and wet coats. Mr. Bellamy stood first. "Your Honor, this is a very simple matter involving property transfer and estate clarification." Then the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. An older woman with silver hair stepped inside carrying a sealed manila envelope. The judge immediately recognized her. "So good to see you again, Ms. Holloway," he said carefully. Richard Bellamy's confidence vanished instantly. Margaret Holloway walked toward the bench with slow, steady steps that somehow made the entire room quieter. I saw my father frown. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered. Margaret handed the envelope to the judge. "Direct instructions from Linda Carter," she said calmly. "To be opened only if her granddaughter appeared in court without representation." The judge broke the seal. He read the first page silently. Then he stopped. Actually stopped breathing for a second. Mr. Bellamy frowned uneasily. "Your Honor." The judge handed him the document. Bellamy's face drained of color so fast it honestly frightened me. "Oh my God," he whispered. My father leaned forward. "What?" Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom of the page like he'd seen a ghost. "Oh my God, look at that signature." Dad's knees buckled against the wooden chair. "Linda?" And that was the moment my family realized Grandma hadn't left this world nearly as helpless as they believed. 3 weeks earlier, I stood alone in a cemetery outside Raleigh, North Carolina, while cold February wind blew through rows of gray headstones. My grandmother had always hated dramatic funerals. "Waste of money," she used to say. So the service was small, quiet, simple, just the way she wanted. I wore my Navy dress whites because I'd flown in directly from Norfolk Naval Station after my leave request was finally approved. My parents didn't hug me when I arrived. Dad barely even looked at me. He just nodded toward my uniform. "You still doing all that Navy stuff?" All that Navy stuff. 20 years of service reduced to a sentence. I should have been used to it by then. But somehow it still hurt. Inside the church fellowship hall after the burial, people gathered around folding tables, eating casseroles and banana pudding, while soft country gospel music played from an old speaker near the kitchen. My mother spent most of the afternoon discussing Grandma's property. Not grieving. Not remembering. Just discussing assets. "The taxes alone are going to be a nightmare," she complained while stirring sweet tea. Dad nodded. "We'll probably sell the farmhouse fast as possible." I looked up sharply. Dad gave me a confused look like I'd spoken out of turn. "Well, obviously." I stared at him for several seconds. Grandma Linda's farmhouse sat on 12 acres outside town. It wasn't some giant fortune, but the place mattered to her. That porch. Those gardens. The old oak tree out front where she used to sit every evening reading mystery novels while drinking coffee. That house held her whole life. "You already decided to sell it?" I asked quietly. Mom sighed dramatically. "Emily, honey, these things are complicated. You live in Virginia. You're never here." "Never here." I heard that phrase most of my adult life. Never here for birthdays. Never here for Christmas. Never here when Dad had surgery. Never here when the roof leaked. As if military service was some selfish vacation I'd chosen to avoid them. My older brother Mark avoided eye contact completely while shoving deviled eggs onto a paper plate. That was Mark's specialty. Avoiding things. Especially conflict. Especially when our parents were wrong. Dad lowered his voice. "Besides, your grandmother depended on us those last few years." I nearly laughed. Depended on them. I was the one calling her every Sunday from whatever base or deployment zone I happened to be stationed in. I was the one paying for the new water heater 2 winters ago after Grandma quietly admitted she couldn't afford it. I was the one she trusted enough to tell the truth, and the truth was simple. My parents visited Linda when it benefited them. I visited because I loved her. That night after everyone left, I drove alone to the small roadside motel outside town where I always stayed during visits home. The same faded sign buzzed outside. The same floral bedspread. The same smell of old carpet and cigarette smoke buried deep in the walls despite years of no-smoking policies. I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing part of my uniform. That's when I opened Grandma's final letter. Her handwriting shook more than it used to, but it was still unmistakably hers. Emily, if you're reading this, I'm probably somewhere arguing with St. Peter about his coffee. Now listen carefully. You were never hard to love. Don't let anybody rewrite your life and convince you otherwise. I had to stop reading for a minute after that, because no one had ever said those words to me before. Not once. Not in 38 years. Outside rain tapped softly against the motel window. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes. Suddenly I was 19 again, standing in our kitchen with Navy recruitment papers in my hand while Dad shouted that military women ended up lonely and bitter. Mom cried because she thought I'd never get married. Mark sat there silently eating mashed potatoes. Only Grandma Linda smiled. She drove me to the recruiter's office herself the next morning in her old Buick. You go see the world, she told me. What if I fail, I asked. She squeezed my hand. Then fail bravely. I still remembered those words 20 years later. The next morning after the funeral, Dad called me before sunrise. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to talk about Grandma. He called about court. Apparently, Linda's estate documents had complications. And somehow those complications were serious enough to involve probate litigation. You probably ought to get yourself a lawyer, Dad said casually. I looked out the motel window toward the empty highway. Why? There was a pause. Then he answered carefully. Well, because your grandmother left some confusing paperwork. That was the first moment I realized something bigger was happening beneath the surface. And somehow, Grandma had known it was coming. I didn't sleep much after my father's phone call. The rain continued most of the night, tapping softly against the motel window, while 18-wheelers rumbled down the highway outside. Around 3 a.m, I finally gave up pretending to sleep and walked to the small coffee machine near the motel office. The coffee tasted burnt enough to strip paint. Grandma would have laughed at that. Bad coffee builds character, she always said. I sat alone in the dim lobby, holding the paper cup with both hands while trying to make sense of everything. Probate litigation. Confusing paperwork. Get yourself a lawyer. None of it sounded right. Grandma Linda had been organized her entire life. The woman labeled extension cords in her garage. She kept appliance warranties from the 1980s in neat folders. There was no universe where she accidentally created legal confusion, which meant one thing. Whatever was happening was intentional. The next afternoon I drove out to Linda's farmhouse. The gravel road looked smaller than I remembered. Winter had stripped most of the trees bare, and the old white farmhouse sat beneath gray Carolina skies like something quietly waiting to be forgotten. Dad's truck already sat parked outside. So did Mom's SUV. I stayed in my car for a moment watching them through the windshield. My father stood near the barn talking with a realtor. Already. Grandma had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. Something inside me hardened a little then. Not anger exactly. Just clarity. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch. Dad looked annoyed the second he saw me. What are you doing here? I stared at him. It's Grandma's house. He crossed his arms. Not for long. The realtor awkwardly pretended to examine the property line, while my mother emerged from the front door carrying a cardboard box filled with Linda's things. Family photographs, cookbooks, old letters. My chest tightened immediately. Mom, I said carefully, what are you doing? Cleaning. She just died. Mom sighed dramatically like I was being difficult on purpose. Emily, this isn't a movie. Real life keeps moving. Real life. Another phrase people use when they want permission to behave badly. I walked past them into the house. The smell hit me first. Coffee. Lavender. Old wood. Grandma. Everything looked exactly the same. Her knitted blanket still draped across the couch. Reading glasses sat beside the recliner near the lamp. A half-finished crossword puzzle rested on the kitchen table. For one impossible second, it felt like she might walk in from the garden any minute asking whether I wanted pie. Then reality settled back in, and the silence hurt worse than I expected. I slowly walked toward the hallway when my father's voice followed behind me. Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly near the end. I turned around. What's that supposed to mean? Dad rubbed his jaw. She got confused sometimes. That was a lie. And we both knew it. Linda Carter was sharper at 82 than most people were at 50. 3 months earlier, she'd beaten me at poker while explaining why the Navy overpaid defense contractors. Confused people don't do that. Mom placed the cardboard box on the table. There were papers everywhere, she added carefully. Legal papers, notes, financial stuff. What kind of papers? Dad answered too quickly. Nothing important. That's when I knew. They were hiding something. That evening after they finally left, I stayed alone at the farmhouse. The quiet there felt different from the quiet inside my apartment back in Norfolk. This quiet had memory inside it. I wandered slowly through each room, touching familiar things. The hallway wall still displayed my Navy graduation photo from Great Lakes. Not Mark's high school football picture. Not Dad's business award. Mine. Grandma always kept mine in the center. I smiled faintly at that. Then I noticed something strange. One picture frame near the hallway looked crooked. Grandma hated crooked frames. I lifted it carefully. Behind it sat a small sealed envelope taped to the wall. My heart started pounding immediately. Across the front in Linda's shaky handwriting were 5 words. For Emily, if necessary. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table before opening it. Inside was another letter. Short. Direct. Exactly like her. Sweetheart, if your parents challenge my wishes, call Margaret Holloway immediately. Trust nobody else. The number is attached. And Emily, I know exactly what I'm doing. Love always, Grandma. Attached beneath the note was a business card. Margaret Holloway, Esquire. Washington, D.C. Military Estate and Federal Council. I stared at the card for a long time. Then I laughed softly to myself. Of course. Of course Grandma had planned ahead. I first met Margaret Holloway when I was 23 years old. At the time, I was stationed in Bahrain during one of the hardest years of my Navy career. My marriage had collapsed after endless deployments and distance. My ex-husband finally admitted he was tired of living with the Navy version of me. I remember calling Grandma from overseas one night after signing divorce papers. I cried harder than I intended. Not because I lost the marriage, but because I felt like I'd failed at being normal. Failed at being a woman somehow. Grandma listened quietly for nearly an hour. Then she said something I never forgot. Emily, there's nothing wrong with women who survive differently. A week later, care packages started arriving from home. Cookies, coffee, handwritten jokes, new socks, and one legal packet containing financial documents I needed for the divorce. Inside was a note. Margaret helped organize this. She's smarter than most senators. That was Linda. Even her comfort came prepared. The next morning, I finally called the number. A calm older woman answered on the second ring. Margaret Holloway speaking. This is Emily Carter, I said nervously. Linda Carter's granddaughter. Silence. Then her voice softened instantly. Oh, sweetheart. Just those 2 words nearly broke me. She told me you might call, Margaret continued gently. You knew Grandma. Knew her, honey. Your grandmother saved my career in 1978. That surprised me enough to laugh. What? Margaret chuckled softly. We worked together at a military law office in D.C. long before you were born. Linda was the smartest legal secretary I ever met. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly pieces started connecting. The organized paperwork. The hidden letters. The confidence. She planned this, didn't she? I whispered. Margaret paused carefully. Your grandmother understood people better than they understood themselves. That sounded exactly like Linda. Margaret continued. Emily, your grandmother was deeply concerned before she passed. Concerned about what? Your parents. The room fell silent around me. Outside the farmhouse window, wind moved through the dead winter grass. She believed they intended to pressure the estate process after her death, Margaret explained calmly. So she prepared documentation in advance. I closed my eyes. Even now, even dying, Grandma was still protecting me. Margaret spoke again. Can you come to Norfolk next Thursday? That's the hearing date. I know. There was a long pause. Then Margaret said something that made my stomach tighten. Bring no attorney. What? Trust me. I stared out toward Grandma's garden. Dead roses bent beneath cold February wind. Okay, I whispered finally. Margaret's voice softened again. Your grandmother loved you very much, Emily. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. And for the first time since the funeral, I stopped feeling afraid. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the motel bathroom mirror, buttoning my navy dress uniform with hands that looked steadier than I felt. Outside, Norfolk was wrapped in cold gray rain again. Funny how storms seem to arrive exactly when life turns heavy. I stared at my reflection for a long moment. 38 years old. Commander's pin on my collar. 20 years of service. 2 deployments in the Persian Gulf. A Navy Achievement Medal. A divorce. No children. No real place that ever fully felt like home. And somehow, one probate courtroom still had the power to make me feel 12 years old again. I picked up Grandma Linda's letter from the sink counter and folded it carefully into my inside coat pocket. Then I drove to court alone. The courthouse parking lot was already crowded when I arrived. My parents stood near the entrance beneath a black umbrella while their attorney smoked beside the sidewalk. My older brother Mark lingered nearby with his hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. The second Dad saw me, his mouth tightened. "You really came without counsel." I locked my car quietly. "That seems to bother you." Dad scoffed. "It concerns me." No, it didn't. What concerned him was uncertainty. My father liked situations he could control. Predictable things. Weak people. And today, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't completely sure what I knew. Mom stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Emily, there's still time to handle this privately." I looked at her carefully. "Privately," Dad answered before she could. "Your grandmother was confused near the end. We don't want the court wasting time over paperwork mistakes." There it was again. Confused. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I swallowed it down. Grandma deserved better than a screaming match in a courthouse parking lot. So I simply asked, "What exactly are you afraid the judge might see?" Dad's face hardened immediately. "Don't start acting dramatic." Mark still said nothing. He just stared at the wet pavement like a man hoping the earth might open beneath him. We walked inside together in silence. Probate Courtroom B felt too small for the amount of tension sitting inside it. Old wooden pews lined the room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere nearby, a copier machine clicked endlessly through courthouse walls. A few local townspeople sat quietly in the back rows. Small-town gossip travels fast, especially when family money's involved. Richard Bellamy stood confidently at the plaintiff's table, organizing stacks of paperwork. He smiled politely at me, though the expression never reached his eyes. "Commander Carter," he said. "Still no attorney?" "No, sir." His smile widened slightly. "Well, that's certainly your choice." Translation: "You're about to lose badly." I took my seat without answering. Dad leaned toward Mom and whispered something that made her smirk. For a second, I remembered being 16 years old, sitting at our dinner table after telling my parents I wanted to apply for an ROTC scholarship. Dad laughed outright. "A girl from this family joining the military." Mom shook her head sadly. "You're too emotional for that kind of life." Funny thing about people who underestimate you. Eventually they start believing their own version of reality. Judge Bennett entered exactly at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. The hearing began quickly. Bellamy moved first. "Your Honor, this matter concerns the estate of Linda Carter, deceased, specifically several irregular documents discovered shortly before probate transfer." He spoke smoothly, professionally, like a man fully convinced victory was routine. He presented my parents as devoted caregivers, responsible, self-sacrificing. He described me as largely absent from family affairs due to military obligations. That phrase irritated me more than it should have. Absent, as though serving your country erased your place in your own family. Bellamy continued. "The plaintiffs believe Ms. Carter may have exercised undue emotional influence over the deceased during periods of isolation." That finally made me look up sharply. Undue emotional influence? I almost laughed. Grandma Linda was the strongest-minded woman I'd ever known. Nobody manipulated her. Nobody. Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses. "Commander Carter," he said calmly, "do you intend to respond?" Every eye in the courtroom turned toward me. My parents looked almost eager. I stood slowly and said exactly what Margaret instructed me to say. "I was advised to wait, Your Honor." Confusion flickered across Bellamy's face. Dad frowned. The judge looked mildly irritated. "Wait for what?" Before I could answer, the courtroom doors opened. Again. Margaret Holloway entered wearing a dark navy coat and carrying a leather briefcase. Even at her age, she moved with remarkable confidence. The entire atmosphere shifted instantly. Bellamy's posture changed first, then the judge's expression, then everyone else's. Judge Bennett actually stood halfway from his chair. "Ms. Holloway." Margaret nodded politely. "Your Honor." Bellamy looked stunned. "You're representing Commander Carter." Margaret removed a pair of reading glasses calmly. "Number." Bellamy blinked. "No." I'm here representing the documented final directives of Linda Carter. Silence settled across the courtroom. Real silence. The kind that makes people suddenly aware of every tiny sound in the room. Rain against windows. Paper shifting. Someone coughing quietly in the back row. Margaret opened her briefcase and removed a sealed file. Your Honor, she said, Linda Carter prepared legal contingencies several years ago in anticipation of precisely this situation. Dad's face lost color immediately. How he whispered. Margaret ignored him. She handed the documents to the judge. Judge Bennett reviewed the first pages silently, then slower, then very slowly. His eyebrows lifted. Richard Bellamy shifted uneasily beside the plaintiff's table. Your Honor, he asked carefully. The judge handed him the file. Bellamy scanned the documents. I watched the exact moment panic entered his eyes. His face drained completely. Oh my God, he whispered. Dad leaned forward sharply. What is it? Bellamy kept reading. There were notarized property transfers, medical evaluations confirming Linda's mental competency, recorded financial statements, and handwritten testimony documenting repeated pressure attempts made by my parents during Linda's final year. But that wasn't the part that shattered the room. The final page did that. Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom like he couldn't process what he was seeing. Oh my God, he repeated quietly. Then he looked directly at my father. You told me Linda Carter handled this paperwork herself. Dad swallowed hard. She did. Bellamy's voice dropped. No, sir. She absolutely did not. Mom gripped the edge of the table. What does that mean? Bellamy turned the final page toward them. At the bottom sat the signature that changed everything. Margaret Holloway, former Federal Military Counsel, former advisor to the Department of the Navy, one of the most respected estate litigators on the East Coast. Dad's knees literally buckled against his chair. Linda, he whispered weakly. And suddenly I understood. Grandma hadn't just prepared paperwork. She had built a shield around me years before she died. Judge Bennett removed his glasses slowly. Based on these filings, he said carefully, the court recognizes full legal transfer authority previously granted to Commander Emily Carter. The room stayed completely still. Then the judge added the sentence that finally broke my parents completely. And furthermore, this court will review evidence suggesting possible coercion attempts against the deceased. Mom burst into tears instantly. Dad turned toward Bellamy in panic. You said this was routine. Bellamy stared at him coldly now. Sir, you failed to disclose critical information. For the first time in my entire life. My father looked afraid of me. Not angry. Not disappointed. Afraid. And honestly, that hurt more than I expected it would. The hearing ended less than 40 minutes later. 40 minutes. That was all it took to unravel years of lies, assumptions, and quiet family manipulation. People always imagine courtroom victories as dramatic celebrations, music swelling, heroes walking confidently into sunlight. Real life doesn't feel like that. Real life feels exhausting. By the time I stepped outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low and gray over downtown Norfolk. Reporters weren't waiting. No applause echoed through the streets. Just cold wind, traffic, and the strange emptiness that comes after emotional shock. Margaret Holloway walked beside me quietly, carrying her leather briefcase. You handled yourself well, she said. I gave a tired laugh. I barely spoke. That's usually wiser in court. We stopped near the courthouse steps. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I looked at her. How long did Grandma plan this? Margaret smiled faintly. Longer than you realize. I shook my head slowly. She knew they'd challenge everything. She hoped they wouldn't, Margaret answered gently. But Linda understood human nature very well. That sounded exactly right. Grandma trusted carefully, loved deeply, and prepared thoroughly. Margaret adjusted her coat against the wind. She worried less about the property, she admitted, and more about what your parents might do to you emotionally once she was gone. That sentence hit harder than the court ruling itself. Because it was true. This was never only about land, or money, or a farmhouse. It was about power. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who spent years being treated like an outsider inside their own family? By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone already contained 6 missed calls. 3 from Mom, 2 from Dad, 1 from Mark. I ignored all of them. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply couldn't handle another conversation yet. Instead, I drove back to Linda's farmhouse. The farther I got from Norfolk, the quieter my thoughts became. Rainwater still clung to the fields along the highway. Bare trees blurred past my windows while old country songs played softly through the radio speakers. At some point during the drive, I realized something strange. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Deeply sad. Because Court had confirmed something I spent most of my life trying not to admit. My parents never truly understood me. Maybe they never wanted to. The farmhouse looked softer in the late afternoon light. I parked beside the porch and sat in the car for several minutes before finally going inside. The house greeted me with silence again. But not empty silence, comfortable silence. Linda's kind of silence. I made coffee automatically using the old machine she'd owned since I was in high school. The thing sounded like a lawnmower every time it brewed. Grandma refused to replace it. Suffering builds appreciation, she used to joke. I carried the mug into the living room and sat in her recliner. That's when the memories started arriving harder than before. Birthdays missed during deployment. Christmas video calls from military bases overseas. Promotions my parents barely acknowledged. The time Dad told neighbors Mark was the one who stayed loyal to the family, as if service members abandoned people by serving elsewhere. I stared at the family photographs lining the shelf. Most included Mark. His baseball trophies, his wedding, his children. Normal milestones. Traditional milestones, the kind my parents understood. Then there was me, always in uniform, always leaving again, always slightly outside the picture even when standing inside it. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I remembered a conversation from years earlier. I had just returned from deployment overseas. Grandma and I sat together on this very porch drinking coffee while summer cicadas screamed through the trees. "You know what your problem is?" she asked me. I smiled. "Only one. You spend your whole life trying to earn love from people who already decided not to understand you." That memory nearly broke me now, because she was right. She had always been right. Around 7 o'clock, headlights appeared outside. I looked through the curtains and saw Mark climbing slowly out of his truck. Of everyone in the family, Mark looked the worst after Court. Not angry, not defeated, ashamed. I opened the door before he reached the porch. He shoved his hands awkwardly into his pockets. Hey. Neither of us moved for a second. Then he asked quietly, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. Mark walked through the farmhouse slowly, like someone entering a church after years away. We sat at the kitchen table where Grandma used to serve pancakes every Sunday morning. For several minutes he said nothing. Finally he looked at me. I should have said something sooner. I already knew what he meant. But I let him say it anyway. "They treated you differently your whole life." I stared down at my coffee. Mark rubbed both hands over his face. "I knew it, Em." That nickname hurt unexpectedly. He hadn't called me that in years. He swallowed hard. I didn't want to fight with Dad. There it was. The truth. Simple. Ugly. Human. I nodded slowly. "You depended on him." "Yeah, you still do." Mark looked embarrassed. "Probably." Silence settled between us again. Then he laughed bitterly. "You know what's crazy?" "What?" "Grandma always talked about you like you were the brave one." I almost smiled. She exaggerated. "No," Mark said quietly, "she didn't." That hit me harder than I expected. Because Mark had spent most of our lives staying neutral, safe, watching conflict from the sidelines. Hearing him say that now mattered. Later that night, after Mark left, another car pulled into the driveway. This time it was my mother, alone. She stood on the porch, clutching her purse tightly against her chest, while cold wind moved through the dark yard behind her. For a moment she looked older than I'd ever seen her. Tired, too. I opened the door without speaking. Mom stepped inside carefully. "I won't stay long." I nodded toward the kitchen. She sat down slowly at the table but didn't remove her coat. Neither of us knew how to begin. Finally she whispered, "She always admired you." I looked up. "Grandma." Mom nodded. "She used to talk about you constantly." Something tightened painfully inside my chest. Mom stared down at her hands. "She admired your independence." I waited quietly. Then Mom said the sentence I never expected to hear from her. "You became everything I never had the courage to be." The room went completely still. Outside wind rattled softly against the farmhouse windows. I stared at my mother while years of resentment, confusion, and sadness shifted uneasily inside me. And for the first time in my life, I realized she might have been afraid too. My mother stayed at the farmhouse less than 20 minutes that night. Long enough to say things neither of us fully knew how to handle. Not long enough to fix 38 years of distance. Before leaving, she paused beside the front door with her hand resting on the knob. "I know your father went too far," she said quietly. I folded my arms. "You went along with it." She nodded once. "No excuses." Honestly, that surprised me more than denial would have. Mom looked around the farmhouse slowly. She loved this place. I know. She wanted you here. My throat tightened slightly. Then Mom said something that stayed with me long after she drove away. You know, when you joined the Navy, your father thought you were rejecting us. I frowned. I joined because I needed my own life. I know that now. But back then they didn't. Or maybe they couldn't. Some parents confuse independence with abandonment, especially when their children grow into people they no longer control. After she left, I locked the front door and walked quietly through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. The farmhouse creaked softly beneath my footsteps. Every corner held memory. Grandma teaching me how to make biscuits in the kitchen. Grandma showing me constellations from the backyard during humid Carolina summers. Grandma driving me to the recruiter's office while Dad refused to speak to me. She had been the bridge between me and the rest of the family for years. And now she was gone. I sat down at the kitchen table around midnight holding the final sealed letter Margaret had given me after court. Linda wanted you to read this only after the hearing, she'd said. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. My hands trembled more than I expected. Inside were 4 handwritten pages folded carefully together. The first line alone nearly broke me. Sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I was right about what would happen. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, she knew me well enough to understand I'd need a minute before continuing. I kept reading. First things first. The house, the land, and the savings are not your burden. They are not payment for suffering. And they are certainly not rewards for pain. I left them to you because you understand responsibility better than the rest of this family. Tears blurred the page for a moment. I wiped them away carefully. You spent your whole life believing love had to be earned through sacrifice. That was never true. The right people love you because you are you. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Outside wind moved through the trees surrounding the farmhouse. Everything felt very still, very far away. Then I reached the final page. And that was the page that changed me. Emily, do not become hard simply because others were hard to you. Bitterness is a lonely way to grow old. I have seen too much of it already. If this family breaks apart after I'm gone, let it break because of truth, not revenge. You are stronger than anger. Always remember that. I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter. Long enough for the coffee beside me to go cold. Long enough for dawn to begin lightening the windows. And somewhere during those quiet early morning hours, something inside me finally loosened. Not forgiveness exactly, but exhaustion. I was tired of carrying anger everywhere. Tired of proving my worth. Tired of needing my parents to become different people before I allowed myself peace. 3 days later, I met Margaret Holloway for lunch near the waterfront in Norfolk. The restaurant overlooked gray winter water where small boats rocked gently against the docks. Margaret ordered black coffee and tomato soup. Your grandmother loved this place, she said while unfolding her napkin. I smiled faintly. She loved everywhere with decent pie. Margaret laughed softly. That too. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The Navy. Travel. Old stories about Linda during her years working in military law offices. Apparently my grandmother once embarrassed a Pentagon attorney by correcting his paperwork in front of an entire meeting. That sounded exactly like her. Then Margaret looked at me carefully. What will you do now? I stirred my coffee slowly. I'm not sure yet. You could pursue additional legal action. I know. The coercion evidence alone might have destroyed my parents financially if I pushed harder. Public embarrassment. Civil penalties? Potential fraud investigations. A younger version of me might have wanted that. Or maybe a more wounded version. But sitting there by the harbor listening to gulls outside the restaurant windows, I realized something important. I didn't actually want revenge anymore. Not real revenge. What I wanted was freedom. Freedom from resentment. Freedom from constantly reopening old wounds, hoping they'd heal differently. I looked at Margaret. I think Grandma already won. Margaret smiled softly. Yes, she said, I believe she did. Over the next several weeks, I made decisions my family never expected. I sold a small, undeveloped portion of the land near the highway and used part of the money to establish a scholarship fund for Navy families in eastern North Carolina. Nothing enormous, just enough to help military kids with tuition or emergency expenses. I named it the Linda Carter Family Resilience Fund. Margaret cried when I told her. Dad called twice, trying to discuss financial fairness. I didn't return the calls. Not out of cruelty. I simply understood something now. Some conversations only reopen damage. I also restored the farmhouse instead of selling it. Slowly, carefully. I repaired the porch steps, repainted the kitchen, planted new roses beside the front walkway where Grandma used to garden every spring. And for the first time in years, I slowed down enough to breathe. Military life teaches you constant movement. Schedules, deadlines, deployment clocks, always preparing for the next thing. But the farmhouse moved differently. Morning coffee on the porch, rain against tin roofing, birds settling into oak trees at dusk. Simple things, human things. One afternoon while planting tomatoes in the backyard garden, my elderly neighbor Mrs. Donahue leaned across the fence watching me work. "You know something," she said. "What's that?" "Your grandmother didn't save you with money." I brushed dirt from my hands. "No." Mrs. Donahue smiled gently. "She saved you with love." I looked out across the property then. The garden, the porch swing, the old oak tree swaying quietly in warm Carolina wind. And suddenly I understood exactly what Grandma had really left me. Not land, not inheritance, not victory. Permission. Permission to stop fighting for love that should have been freely given all along. 1 year later, the farmhouse finally felt alive again. Not polished, not perfect, alive. The porch had fresh white paint now. New flower boxes hung beneath the front windows, overflowing with yellow daisies and red geraniums. Wind chimes Grandma once loved swayed gently in the warm Carolina breeze. And for the first time in decades, the house sounded happy. Soft conversation drifted through the backyard while folding chairs filled slowly beneath the old oak tree. A few of my Navy friends had driven down from Norfolk for the memorial gathering. Nothing formal, just food, stories, coffee, and people who loved Linda Carter. I wore jeans and a dark navy jacket instead of dress whites that afternoon. Somehow it felt more honest that way. Less ceremony, more family, real family, the kind you build through loyalty instead of obligation. Mrs. Donahue arrived carrying peach cobbler. Margaret Holloway brought old photographs from her years working with Grandma in Washington. Even Mark showed up early to help arrange tables in the yard. Watching my brother carry folding chairs across the grass, I realized he looked older than the year before. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man finally learning what silence had cost him. "You need anything else?" he asked. I handed him a box of paper plates. "Can you put these near the drinks?" "Yep." A small answer. Simple, but somehow meaningful. That was how healing worked sometimes. Not dramatic speeches. Not movie moments. Just small efforts repeated consistently over time. By late afternoon, golden sunlight filtered softly through the trees while people shared stories about Grandma. Most made us laugh. Apparently, Linda once chased a traveling vacuum salesman off the property with a broom because he insulted her coffee. Margaret nearly cried laughing while telling that story. She told him Margaret wheezed, "Any man who dislikes strong coffee probably can't be trusted around machinery." That sounded exactly like Linda. I looked around the yard watching people smile beneath the fading sunlight. For so many years I believed loneliness was permanent, something stitched into my life forever. But sitting there listening to laughter around Grandma's farmhouse, I realized loneliness changes when people finally stop pretending around each other. Then I noticed a familiar pickup truck pulling slowly into the driveway. My father's truck. Conversation around the yard softened slightly as Dad stepped out wearing pressed jeans and a pale blue button-down shirt. My mother climbed out beside him quietly. For a second, nobody moved. Not awkward exactly, just uncertain. Dad looked smaller than I remembered. Age had finally reached him during the past year. His shoulders curved more. His hair had gone nearly white. And the confidence he once carried everywhere now seemed fragile somehow. Mom offered a nervous smile. "Hi, Emily." "Hi." Dad looked around the property silently. The restored porch, the garden, the repaired barn. All the things Grandma loved. "You fixed it up nice," he said quietly. "Thank you." An uncomfortable pause followed. Then Mark walked over carrying a tray of iced tea glasses like he was deliberately trying to keep the peace. Smart man. Dad accepted a drink but barely touched it. For the next hour, my parents stayed mostly near the edge of the gathering, speaking politely with neighbors and listening to stories about Grandma. No arguments, no tension, just distance. And honestly, distance felt healthier than pretending everything was magically repaired. As sunset approached, guests slowly began leaving. One by one, cars disappeared down the gravel road while warm evening light settled across the property. Margaret hugged me tightly before climbing into her car. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," she whispered. I nearly cried hearing that. After most people left, I stood alone near Grandma's garden, gathering empty cups when I heard footsteps behind me. Dad. I kept placing cups into a trash bag quietly while he stopped beside the fence. For a while, neither of us spoke. Crickets hummed through the evening air. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. I was hard on you. I continued tying the trash bag slowly. Yes. No point pretending otherwise anymore. Dad stared out across the property. You know, when you left for the Navy. He paused. I thought you were leaving us behind. I looked at him carefully. I was trying to survive. He nodded faintly like he understood that now, or maybe wished he understood sooner. Dad rubbed one hand over his face tiredly. My father treated me the same way he admitted quietly. Everything was about obedience, respect, control. The honesty surprised me. He gave a weak laugh. I guess somewhere along the line I became him. The evening breeze moved softly through the garden between us. For the first time in my life, my father sounded less like an authority figure, and more like an aging man carrying his own regrets. I spent too much time trying to control people, he said, not enough time loving them. That sentence sat heavily in the silence between us. I looked toward the farmhouse porch where Mom stood quietly watching us from a distance. Then back at Dad. Part of me still hurt deeply. Probably always would. Some wounds don't disappear completely. But something Grandma wrote returned to me then. Let truth end the cycle, not revenge. I finally nodded once. I know. Dad's eyes grew wet for a second before he looked away quickly. That was as close to an apology as he knew how to give. And strangely, it was enough. Not enough to erase the past. Not enough to rebuild everything. But enough to stop carrying hatred forward into whatever years remained. Later that night, after my parents left, I sat alone on the porch, wrapped in a light blanket, while summer insects sang across the fields. The farmhouse glowed softly behind me. Grandma's wind chimes moved gently overhead. I held her final letter in my lap again. The paper had softened from rereading. Moonlight silvered the edges of the garden, while memories drifted quietly through my mind. Lonely deployments. Courtroom humiliation. Years spent trying to earn approval that never came. But also strength. Friendship, service, grace.